And of course, it talks about the passing of Sarah Imenu. And then the Torah discusses how Avraham purchased from Ephron and from the Bnei Ches the Moras Machpelah and the Soda, the area around the Soda as a burial place for Sarah Imenu. And ultimately, it was the burial place for Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and their spouses. And the Torah, the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra, they discuss the question as to what's the significance that the Torah discusses the purchase, how Avraham purchased the land and buried Sarah in the land that he purchased from Ephron. And the Ramban's opinion is that it's, in a sense, to show us the esteem that Avraham was held by the people of that region at that time. Adoni Shmeini and Nasi Elikim Tobasochenu, you are a prince of God in our midst, and with what high regard, the people of Ches considered Avraham. However, the Ramban brings the Ibn Ezra, and the Ibn Ezra offers two other answers why the Torah discusses this question. And one answer is that it's to show us that Eretz Yisrael is a special place, is important for the living as well as for those who died. Now, the Ramban raises a question regarding that, and the Ramban's question is, if the Torah would tell us that Sarah died in Egypt, as the Torah tells us with Yaakov, and that Avraham then took her body back from Egypt. Ramban doesn't mention Egypt, but in any other country besides Eretz Yisrael. So that would show the significance of Eretz Yisrael for those who died, because he went out of his way to transport her Aron to Eretz Yisrael and to bury her in Eretz Yisrael. But in view of the fact that she died in Eretz Yisrael itself, how do we see that burial in Eretz Yisrael is significant for those who passed away? And the Ramban, so and the truth of the matter is, we could ask another question. Okay, that question isn't as strong, but we could ask a question: why couldn't that be demonstrated from the fact that Yaakov asked Yosef? Yaakov did die in Egypt. He died outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. So why was it necessary to bring the whole episode of Avraham purchasing the land from Ephron and Avraham burying Sarah Imenu in Eretz Yisrael as proof that Eretz Yisrael burial in Eretz Yisrael is important, is significant for those who passed away? And now my father, he did not discuss the Ramban, but my father raised somewhat of a different question. It depends how you read the Parsha, but one could read the Parsha that if Avraham wanted it, he could have gotten the Moras Machpelah. even though Ephraim really, Chazal tell us, did not want to give it to him. But because of the social pressure of the Bnei Ches, of the Siyalehim Atah B'Sochenu, so Avraham could have probably gotten the land, the Maras HaMachpelah, for a much cheaper price, perhaps even for free. And still Avraham insisted in paying the full price over Lasocher with the best of money. So how we done? So my father was troubled in view of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave all of Eretz Yisrael to Avraham Avinu. Why did Avraham Avinu have to go out of his way, perhaps more so than anybody else who would be purchasing a piece of land, go out of his way to pay the full price in the best way? And my father said, he mentioned the Rashi in the Gemara in Bava Metzia. The Gemara in Bava Metzia discusses the question if somebody is holding peiros, if someone is holding fruit, and for somebody else, and the fruit are beginning to deteriorate. So the question is, should he sell the fruit, get other fruit in place of it, whatever it might be? Or no, should he keep this fruit for the original owner, even though it's beginning to deteriorate? And the Gemara mentions the concept of Rotza Adam B'Kav Shalo Yoser Metisha Kav Mishal Chavero. A person prefers one measure of his own more than 9 measures of somebody else. And Rashi says, why is that? Why couldn't Rashi was obviously troubled. Let them sell the fruit and with the money purchase other fruit that will be much better fruit before these fruit deteriorate further. And Rashi says, because the person, the owner of the fruit, he worked, he toiled, he planted, he harvested. Because of that, the person has a psychological preference for that which he put his labor in, to that which was produced by somebody else. Rotza Adam B'Kav Shalo Yosem Mitisha Kav Mishal Chavero. So my father said, there is legal title and there is psychological title. And when you purchase something, so there is legal title on it. And depending how hard you work to get it, there might be some psychological title. But when a person planted the fruit himself, he did all the work himself. In a sense, he injects his personality into what he produced. So he identifies with it in a much greater manner. And Avraham wanted, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave all of Eretz Yisrael to Avraham Avinu and to his descendants. But Avraham wanted that on this piece of land of Eretz Yisrael, where the Avos will be buried, that they shouldn't just have legal title. There should be psychological title as well. And he felt that he would have a greater psychological title. And this is not just true in regard to that one piece of land, but that's true in regard to all of Eretz Yisrael. That he wanted to have this psychological title in the land. And because of that, he paid the full price. That there shouldn't be any doubts, that no one should be able to raise any question that would hinder his psychological title in the land. And if we want Derech Hadrush, we could suggest that what is the definition of Eretz Yisrael? What does Eretz Yisrael mean? My grandfather, my father, my uncle, they all talk about Shem Eretz Yisrael. My father would say that Shem Eretz Yisrael took effect when God gave the land to Avraham Avinu. So what distinguishes the land of Eretz Yisrael? What distinguishes the land of Eretz Yisrael is the fact that it belongs to the Jewish people. Now, if all the Jews would get together and buy some area in the United States, that would not make it Eretz Yisrael. Everybody would contribute a dollar bill or $2 bills, whatever it might be. And they would buy parts of Chicago. That wouldn't make it Eretz Yisrael, because then we would be partners in the land. It wouldn't belong to us as a nation. But what Avraham acquired from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Eretz Yisrael as a nation. So the essence of Eretz Yisrael, what makes the land Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is the simple translation. The land of Israel means the land that belongs to the Jewish people as a nation. And when we speak about the Jewish people as a nation, and this is very important, we are not talking about the Jewish people of one particular generation. We're talking about the Jewish people of all generations. So at one time, I wanted to suggest, in terms of the legal perspective, the heavenly legal perspective of Eretz Yisrael, it's an objective question. Does it belong to the Jewish people, or doesn't it belong to the Jewish people? But in terms of the psychological ownership of Eretz Yisrael, then it's a variable. It's a subjective question. There are people who feel that Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jewish nation. There are those who feel that it belongs to the Jewish people of all generations. And there are those who feel that it belongs to the Jewish people of this generation. And in the past, it might have belonged to the Jewish people of those generations. But, and then again, there are probably those who believe that Eretz Yisrael doesn't belong to the Jewish people at all. They believe that the Jewish people are occupiers, that it belongs to those who call themselves Palestinians. Some of the, unfortunately, the Aveinenu Harav, there are those who believe that Eretz Yisrael is, that the Jewish people, I should say, are just occupiers. We usurped the land, we stole the land. But the truth is, so in terms of psychological title, It varies. It's a variable. And I would say to a large degree, people who are in Eretz Yisrael, who fight for the land, they perhaps feel a greater sense of ownership over the land. Some of them see that they're fighting for the land that belonged to the Jewish people of all generations. And some of them, unfortunately, see that it belongs to them of that generation, but not of all generations. But we could suggest that whereas the legal title is an objective question, the psychological title, which is not objective, it's relative on regard to the different people, to the different generations, the different attitudes. So the more that we feel ownership over the land of Eretz Yisrael, especially with that ownership manifests itself in feeling ownership over the land, not just for ourselves, but ownership over the land of Eretz Yisrael for all generations, the more Eretz Yisrael it becomes. Because what makes it Eretz Yisrael is the fact that it belongs to the Jewish people. And the greater, even the psychological feeling of Eretz Yisrael, of ownership of Eretz Yisrael we have, the greater the status of Eretz Yisrael as being the land of the Jewish people. And if we say that, we could suggest, even though I do not believe that that was the point Ibn Ezra was trying to make, that Avraham Avinu wanted to maximize the psychological feeling of Eretz Yisrael belonging to the Jewish people. Because the more Eretz Yisrael it is, the greater the skula, the greater the positive impact it has, l'chaim u'lamesim, in the words of the Ibn Ezra, for the living as well as for the dead. And as far as the question about Yaakov is concerned, we could say that Yaakov was determined to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, not so much because of the significance of Eretz Yisrael, but because of the significance of the fact that there Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were buried. The Torah wanted to emphasize the fact that it's Eretz Yisrael. And with what we said, we could perhaps explain that there was a greater sense of Eretz Yisrael because it was purchased by Avraham, the Kesef Moleh, in the full amount because of the psychological title. But however, I think what the Ibn Ezra is trying to say is something altogether different. The Ibn Ezra is not so concerned why is it mentioned altogether, but the Ibn Ezra is concerned as to why the Torah goes to such length to tell us about the purchase, about the negotiations, and how by Yocham, and how the land, the status of the land became greater when it was purchased by Avraham Avinu. Why does the Torah go to such length? The Torah could merely say that Avraham purchased the land and he buried Sarah. Why does the Torah have to go to emphasize with all the details? So we could say because the Torah goes to details, because that gives significance to the burial of Sarah. If the burial of Sarah was only because she died there, it wouldn't be so significant. She was buried where she died. But the Torah gives significance to the burial of Sarah in order to tell us that Sarah's burial was done in a very special way. And it wasn't written so much to tell us about Sarah per se, but to tell us through what was happened to Sarah for future generations to know. And if we have time, I'll go into that a little bit more. But then, the Ibn Ezra gives a second answer. And the second answer the Ibn Ezra gives is that the Torah wants to let us know that the commitment that Avraham, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to Avraham, that God gave to Abraham, that the land of Eretz Yisrael will be a nachala, will be an inheritance for him and his descendants, was fulfilled in his lifetime. And the Ramban says it wasn't fulfilled in his lifetime. The land of Eretz Yisrael only became an inheritance later on, when generations later on came into Eretz Yisrael and took possession of the land. So how does this show the fact that he bought this land from Ephron and from the Bnei Ches? How does it show that the land was that the commitment God gave to Avraham was fulfilled in Avraham's lifetime? Now, if you take a look at the Parsha, you get the impression that in a certain sense, the land of Eretz Yisrael, the purchase of the Maras Machpelah and the land around the Maras Machpelah was not just purchased from Ephron, but to a certain degree, Avraham wanted that the sale of this land should be approved by the Bnei Ches. He didn't approach Ephron independently. But Ephron was Yoshe B'soch B'nei Ches. He sat in their midst. A person could suggest that in order to purchase a piece of land within the area of the Bnei Ches, so you needed approval. Just like today, when you purchase a house, it has to be registered. And the person could suggest that maybe that was the real estate law at that time, that all sale of real estate had to be approved by the local government. But I think it's much more than that. As a matter of fact, I think the pasuk implies that. At the end, it says, "Vayokom hasada v'amara asher bo la'Avram." So, thus the field with its cave rose up. It came higher in status in its being sold to Avram la'achuzas kever, as an estate for burial site, mi'eis b'nei Ches, from the children of Ches. It doesn't say It doesn't say Me'es Ephron. So ultimately, the purchase wasn't just from Ephron, but the purchase was from the Bnei Ches themselves. What does that mean? Well, let's say a person owns a house in Chicago. I'm using Chicago because that's where I live. And let's say I own a piece of land in Chicago. I own my house. And if I should sell my house, so whoever I sell the house to, he becomes the owner of the house. But the house still remains as part of Chicago. The mayor, the board of aldermen, I guess to a certain sense, the Democratic Party here, they retain their control and to a certain degree their overall ownership over the land. The Kinyan Kloli, my father would call it, as opposed to the Kinyan Prati. Avraham wanted the purchase of the Maras Machpelah not to be just the purchase from Ephron, but he wanted to purchase it from the Bnei Ches as well. Ephron had the Kinyan Prati, the ownership over the property, but that property was part of the jurisdiction and the property of the Bnei Ches. If I buy a piece of property, I could place whatever flag I want over that property, but it still remains part of the United States. I can't declare my property as a separate country. Avraham wanted that the Maras HaMachpelah should be something altogether different. And so to a certain degree, we could suggest that this represents, in a sense, the beginning. And it sets the precedent for the Jewish people to understand, what does Kibush Haaretz mean? Kibush Haaretz, conquest of the land. Ownership over the land is not accomplished just by living in the land. Yes, no one is denying that even when you had the British Mandate, or whatever they called it, that there was a mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz. You see, the Rishonim, the Ramban, had such chibas haaretz. And certainly at that time, the land of Israel was not under the jurisdiction of the Jewish people. But the full Kiyum HaMitzvah, V'yirashtem es haaretz v'yishaftem ba. Ki lachem nasati es haaretz l'reshes osa is only fulfilled when we have complete control over the land of Eretz Yisrael. And ownership over the land of Eretz Yisrael is not just a prerequisite to enable living in Eretz Yisrael. On the contrary, as I mentioned in the share before, living in Eretz Yisrael contributes to our control and ownership over the land. And to a certain degree, that could be attributed to the fact, as I mentioned, that when we take possession of Eretz Yisrael, we are taking possession of Eretz Yisrael not just for our generation, not just for our day, but we have to take possession of it for all generations. What do we see? There were some exceptions, but it's a lot easier for some of the liberal governments in Israel to give back the lands, or to give the lands that the Jewish people do not reside in. So the part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Aretz, of dwelling in the land, is that it should be under our control, and wherever possible under our control, and limiting the ability of those who would like to take it away from us. I would suggest that sometimes it might be necessary to have areas where we might not have people residing, because to ensure the ability of the Jews to reside in the land, so one reason, so in a sense, Avraham represents, he is setting the precedent for the Jewish people of all generations. And the precedent is that Avraham, that his receiving Eretz Yisrael is done in a manner that it's not just that Avraham gets it, that he gets permission to use it, but he gets Eretz Yisrael by eliminating the ownership and control of all others, not just Ephraim, but the Bnei Ches as well. But I think there's another explanation. And the two explanations, I think, go hand in hand. I think that we could suggest that the reason Avraham had to sell the land in front of the Bnei Ches is based on the first Rashi in Chumash. I've mentioned it before. Rashi in Chumash says, "Lo haya haTorah tzarich lahaschil ela me'achodesh hazeh lachem rosh chadashim." The Torah did not have to begin with Bereshis bara. Why? I have discussed that in the past already. Why we started with Bereshis bara. But matam, what's the reason? Shem yomru mos olam. Because if the nations of the world say, listen, matam, you stole the land from the 7 nations, putting it in contemporary terms, if they scream, you are occupiers, the land of Israel doesn't belong to you. Hevei omer lahem, you have to respond to them. Part of the mitzvah of kibush haaretz is to let the nations of the world know that Eretz Yisrael is ours and that we're not occupiers. So there is, in a sense, the mitzvah of Yishuv Aretz is that we have to capture the land in a way, and preferably in a way that the nations of the world come to recognize, or forced to recognize, that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. And even if they will not come to that recognition, or at least officially not come to that recognition, we have to let them know that they are not going to influence us. And we know, unfortunately, the tendency of the Jewish people, that when the nations of the world scream, list them at them, you stole the land, we start saying after a while, you might be right. So the Torah says, you have to answer them, even if you're not going to convince them. Because if you don't answer them, what happened after the 6-Day War? After the 6-Day War, very few Jews were in favor of giving back land. Certainly giving it back for nothing. For promises that meant nothing. But at that time, people might have imagined that it meant something. People might have imagined we could trust the United States government to enforce peace treaties. There was a time when peace treaties would be written that said terrorists have to be given over, and the United States was the third party to that treaty. And it wasn't fulfilled even once. When Palestinian terrorists came. And then when you bring out the facts, and the answer is, oh, please. Okay. People ignore facts. People ignore facts about COVID. Time and time, people are dying. People are going to the hospital. And you walk from communities, I'm told. I don't live in so many of these communities, so I can't talk from personal knowledge. But I'm told that in many of the communities, when you walk, you go to the weddings, you wouldn't know that there is a COVID plague out there. And people are dying. And when you talk to them, I tried talking to them. So one of them said, he had COVID, but he died from something else. Yeah, everybody dies when their heart stops. Everybody dies from a heart attack. Or another one said, the one person I pointed out, he died from COVID itself. Oh, if he didn't die from COVID, he would have died anyway at that time. It's easy to ignore facts, to say, oh, please. Look at the history. The more we gave in, the more the Jewish people gave in. Remember initially, before there was a wall, before Netanyahu's strong stand, every peace treaty that was signed was followed by bombs, by buses being destroyed, people being killed, children being murdered, bombs being placed where there are little carriages with babies. And when you bring out these facts from the left-wingers among us, their response is, oh, please. It's easy to deny the facts. Because no one holds you to the facts. So we have to let the nations of the world know that Eretz Yisrael is ours. And this is the mitzvah, have a omer lahem. You tell them. Because if we don't tell it to them, and if we allow them to say the fact, to say what they want, and we allow them to deny the facts, then we will begin to believe, listimanu, we stole the land. Now, I'm mentioning this because there's been talk again about the significance of the fact that the United States recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And the question is, what is the significance of the fact that the embassy of the United States is in Jerusalem? I've heard people say that it's just a building. You know, and certain, and that's true. It's just the building. But sometimes there are implications. It's not just the building. If a man is makadesh a woman, he gives her a ring. He didn't just give her a ring. He established a relationship with her. The same thing is true. When the United States moved its embassy, it wasn't just the building. And it's dangerous to suggest it was just the building. Let's understand the significance of it. What was the claim of the nations of the world? The claim of the nations of the world is that the land of Israel belongs to the Palestinians. There was no such nationality at any time beforehand. But that's also a part of the oh please. So, but the Jerusalem was historically, and what is our claim? Our claim is that the Jewish people, this is in the Declaration of the Independence of the State of Israel, and I don't need the Declaration of the State of Israel. It's in the Torah. We have a historical right to Eretz Yisrael. God gave Eretz Yisrael to Avraham Avinu, gave it to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, and we inherited it. So having Yerushalayim, it's not just a question of Yerushalayim, although that in itself would be significant. Recognition of Yerushalayim as the capital of Israel is recognizing the historical right of the Jewish people. More than that, even if somebody disagrees, the very fact that the embassy is in Tel Aviv, that's a statement that we do not recognize the historical right of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. Why would they have their embassy in Tel Aviv when all the government buildings are in Yerushalayim. They're not there because of the movie section, the theater section in Tel Aviv. They're there to say that we do not recognize Yerushalayim as the capital of Israel. And when they're saying we do not recognize Yerushalayim as the capital of Israel, they're in effect saying we do not recognize the historical right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And in a sense, they're saying the Jewish people are occupiers. What can we do? They're there. And when the Jewish people will say it's just a building, now there's already talk that the PLO offices are going to be recognized. There's already talk about the United States having a special office in the old city of Yerushalayim to deal with the PLO. And they'll say, they'll be very liberal. They'll say, okay, we would not have moved the embassy there, but now that it's there, it's there. So how does that work? But what they'll say is, it's just a building. Even the Jews themselves say it's just a building. Even the Israelis say it's just a building. The mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz is to negate the ability of the nations of the world to give the impact on the Jews of listimatem, of saying listimatem. Menachem Begin, this was before he became prime minister, once said, it's time that our government stop putting pressure on the United States government to put pressure on the Israeli government to give up land. Here it's not just a question of giving up land. It's a question of giving up the recognition of the historical right of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. And so we could suggest that this was what the idea of it was the beginning of the Nachla, the beginning of actualization of the inheritance of Eretz Yisrael. It limited the nations of saying that, matter of fact, the Medrash Rabbah points out that this was one of the areas that the nations of the world will not have an ability to say it didn't belong to the Jewish people because of the money that Avraham paid Ephraim for the land. So this was the beginning, but it set the precedent. It was to set a precedent for future generations. And why is that? But take a look, it's very interesting. In this week's Sedra also, Eliezer is sent by Avraham to get a wife for Yitzchak. And Eliezer, in his heart, really felt that he would like to have Yitzchak marry his daughter. After all, his daughter was brought up in the house of Avraham Avinu. And Rivka was brought up in the house of Psuel, in the house of Lavan. And he felt, why shouldn't Rivka marry his daughter? And the Medrash says, Avraham said to him, you're Orah, you're cursed. You're from Canaan. You're a slave. You're an Eved, a servant. And my son is Baruch, he's blessed. And there couldn't be a marriage between the two. How are we to understand it? But the answer is very simple. The answer is that Avraham, the answer is that Avraham was trying to tell Eliezer, there's a halacha that a Eved doesn't have yichus. An Eved doesn't have pedigree. To a certain degree, a slave, a servant, in those days, his child, in theory, a child could be sold from the parent, and the parent could be sold from the child. In a sense, there was no connection. A slave had no sense of a connection to the future, and no sense of a connection to a past. A slave only had a present. He had the moment, the fleeting moment of the present. What happened to the nefesh asher asu b'charan? To nefesh asher asu b'charan. So there are two pshatim brought down. One pshat, one explanation. The souls that were made in Charan, those were the servants of Avraham. On the other hand, nefesh asher asu b'charan, that's the people that Avraham brought close to God. But where are the descendants of the nefesh asher asu b'charan? Where are their descendants? The answer is they were both. They were servants of Avraham, and they were people who were brought close to God by Avraham and by Sarah. But because they have a servile perspective, a servant only has a perspective of the present. He does not have a perspective of the future. He's not able to link past, present, and future. His father was sold from him, or he was sold from his father. His children could be sold from him. And even though Avraham would not have done those things, but that was their perspective. Their perspective is, where is my next meal going to come from? They didn't have a sense of the future. Avraham Avinu, he had a sense of the future. And when he was, his sense of nachla was for future generations. And when he got the piece of land, when he had a piece of land, it was the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise for future generations. It was to give the future generations a perspective. What does it mean to have Eretz Yisrael? What it means to have Eretz Yisrael, that it's not only the land that legally belongs to the Jewish people, but it's the land that belongs to the Jewish people for all generations. That the other nations do not have control over the land. And it has to be done in such a way that the other nations shouldn't give the people the impression that the land of Eretz Yisrael doesn't belong to the Jewish people. Hevei Omer Lahem, that's part of the mitzvah of Kibush Haaretz. We have to have the nations of the world recognize or limit their ability to influence us, to say that the land of Eretz Yisrael doesn't historically belong to the Jewish people. We have the responsibility not just of taking possession of the land in a manner that the nations of the world could convince us that we're occupiers, but we have to make it clear to ourselves by making it clear to the nations of the world that Eretz Yisrael is ours because of the historical right that we have in Eretz Yisrael, and that we inherited that land for Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Okay.
Okay, so a few questions, a few points about giving it in front of, purchasing it in front of all B'nai Ches. Someone asked, is that like Bar Metzra? I guess meaning that no one else had a claim that they could have bought it first.
I don't know what the real estate issues were over there at the time.
And then there's someone saying that your uncle.
I don't know if there was anybody else bidding for it either.
But the fact that everyone was there, no one could later claim that. Really, okay. I had a okay. And someone said that that your uncle discussed that Avraham asked for permanent easement rights that the government will never be able to take back, and that your uncle also discussed whether the rights continue to Shemayim.
I don't know what my uncle said, but it sounds to me that's very similar to what I just said. Okay. But I said that it was to serve as a precedent for the attitude that future generations should have.
Okay, and then a few questions about purchasing Eretz Yisrael. I guess in the first Aliyah in the 1800s, I guess when people were purchasing it from the Ottomans, was this similar to Avraham buying land, even though they didn't have full control?
Well, you can do what you can do.
Right.
In theory, we should do more, but there were limitations what they were capable of doing at the time. I don't know whether the Ottoman Empire was ready to relinquish all its rights or not.
And then continuing that idea, if monetary redemption is necessary, does that mean that it's more important to give money to the JNF versus doing actual conquest of the land?
Okay, the only thing is the JNF has to change its policy and in regard to the territories that they do work on. The one time, I remember I davened the shul that I'm now rabbi of. I davened when I was a boy, and Rabbi Rich was the rabbi. And one time, the Tisha B'Av, for some reason, that was the day that they used to raise money for the JNF. And I remember it was the Tisha B'Av, perhaps just after the Six-Day War, or maybe a year after that. I don't remember exactly. And Rabbi Rich said, when he announced that to give money to JNF, he says, now with all this additional territory that belongs to the Jewish people, the JNF has a much greater task in front of them. And unfortunately, the JNF abandoned that task, and maybe they changed again. I don't know. I can't say that I've kept track, but what they considered the green line, and they said that they're not going to do any work on the other side of the green line. That's what I was told. I can't say that I thoroughly checked it, but one time the people from the JNF called me, this is years ago, and I asked them that question, and they were very clear that they are not doing any work on the other side of the green line.
So also it sounds like the answer for this would be understood now, but should Yoshua have tried to buy the land before militarily conquering it?
I don't think that was an option.
Right. And that's probably the answer to the next question. Why didn't Avram just purchase the whole Eretz Yisrael?
I don't think that was an option either.
Right. Okay. Um, let me see. Isn't the purchase of one piece of Eretz Yisrael a kind of negation of Hashem giving all of Eretz Yisrael to Avraham?
You got to begin somewhere.
Even if he did a chazaka by walking across Eretz Yisrael.
That's right. You have to that, but the actualization of the purchase. In other words, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, we could suggest the Jewish people have legal control over Eretz Yisrael, legal ownership over Eretz Yisrael. But the actual ownership, in other words, the ability to exercise the ownership, that's something that Avraham did not get.
And then here is interesting question. Could we say the approach of legally acquiring the land fits with what the Gemara, one of the Shavuos at the end of Ksuvo says not to do, to go as a wall?
No, from Rashi, it's very clear that means to go and attack from the outside.
Oh, so therefore, buying it does not.
It's not
in conflict at all.
Yeah, that's right. That's correct. Okay. It's clear from Rashi. It's from the outside to come and attack.
If anyone else has a question, put it in the chat. I think you were mentioning at one point that it might be that for a certain place, you might be able to have Yishuv Eretz Yisrael by not having people live somewhere. Do you mean that there should be sometimes you might need a buffer zone?
The Aver Hayardain, there's an expression in the Ramban that if not for the fact that the Bnei Ruvain and the Bnei Gad asked for the land, that Moshe should have left the land shomein. In other words, left the land without anybody residing there. So the expression, it could be interpreted otherwise, but it's possible, and my father one time interpreted it that way, that it would be part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of Kibush Eretz Yisrael, of having control over Eretz Yisrael, but not living there. Now, the question is, so what would be the purpose of having that piece of land? So I never discussed that question with my father, but I was thinking that perhaps we need a buffer zone. Perhaps there was a need for a buffer zone to protect the land. So then it dawned on me this idea that if it's necessary, and very often when Israel would discuss with the United States officials, they would take them on a helicopter ride and show them how narrow the land they had before 67 was. And even if people are just residing in the land, they need land because of the attitude of the Palestinians or the Arab nations at that time, whatever you want to call it. They needed a buffer zone. So it could be, it might be necessary to have, it's just something that I'm thinking about, it might have been necessary for the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael to have lands that serve as a buffer zone also. And to say that we rely on the goodwill and the honesty of the Arab nations, or if there was those that call themselves Palestinians, the facts has demonstrated, of course there are those who will say, oh please, but the facts have demonstrated that we can't trust them. They still have not handed over their first terrorist, any terrorist which they committed themselves to do. So you have to be stupid or make yourself stupid. There are both types that believe that we can rely on them.
Okay. There's a question. I don't know if we have the answer to that. Why do we call them Palestinians, which reinforces the false narrative rather than calling them Arabs?
Okay, so the reason we're calling them is because they remind us of the Plishtim, who were foreigners who tried to take the land of Eretz Yisrael away from the Jewish people.
Okay. There's no more questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So everyone have a good week. Thank you for joining us here. God willing, next week